Hello and welcome to today's video. I wanted to talk today about triggers, about emotional triggers and all the different types of triggers that we have in our life that we experience. And I wanted to really shed a different perspective or a different light on these triggers and on how you perceive them. Because I think if you start looking at your triggers in a different way, something that I personally discovered is that triggers are truly our friends. They are tools that we can use to guide us and to help us understand where we are at currently on our evolutionary journey, where we are in terms of our spiritual development or emotional or mental development. So I'm going to give some examples of like different types of triggers, and I'm going to talk about the types of triggers that we can have. And I really want you to look at your own triggers as I'm talking about these and kind of just connect the dots and see where you feel aligned to the things that I'm saying about the different types of triggers that there are, and recognize within yourself like where you are at with those, and sort of the intensity in which you are triggered when it comes to certain things, and try to pay attention to like how you get triggered or when you get triggered the most. So there's four main types of triggers that I wrote down here. There are emotional triggers, mental triggers, spiritual, and physical triggers. So all of these different types of triggers are going to help you understand what area of your life you need to work on, what area of your life still has trauma, or where you are still carrying pain, whether it's emotional, physical, mental, spiritual pain. And it's going to give you clues as to how you can overcome those triggers, because once you understand what's like underneath and what's the depth or the foundation of that trigger, then you're really going to be able to sort it out within yourself, and you're going to be able to start working on that part of yourself and really healing that. Because awareness is truly everything. Awareness is the key that unlocks these hidden layers within us, that allows us to have a deeper understanding and a deeper perspective. We've got a bird right at the window, like peeking in. But it gives us like a deeper perspective of what we really truly need to heal within ourselves and what is out of balance. Because at the end of the day, all healing really has to do with balance. It has to do with connecting to that innermost being of ourselves and figuring out, what parts are healed and what parts are unhealed. So when it comes to emotional triggers, an emotional trigger really just kind of sets off your feelings. It really connects on an emotional level, right? And this can come from how freely you were allowed to express yourself as a child, or how much you actually weren't allowed to express yourself as a child. So when we get emotionally triggered by other people, and I'm talking here as an example, like someone says something to you, or someone, does something that evokes an instant kind of like knee-jerk reaction feeling within you, pay attention to that, and pay attention to whether that feeling is coming from a deep place. Like, is it like a deep trigger? Like it's really coming from the depths of you, and it really has a lot of emotional or energetic charge to it? Or is it more of a superficial kind of trigger where you feel it and it comes up and whatever, but then it passes rather quickly? So pay attention to that, because that will also give you hints and clues as to, how deep that issue is, or how superficial, like how healed it actually is, where there's just maybe a couple of layers that you still need to work through. So connect to these triggers, if you will, in a perspective or in a way where you're actually asking yourself, when you get triggered, or when you notice, or even just think back of times when you have been triggered, and ask yourself, like, does this feeling connect to fear? So when I was triggered emotionally by something that somebody said, did that invoke a feeling of fear within me? And if so, then what does that fear have to do with? What does it connect to? Most oftentimes I find one of the main things that we are most afraid of is death. So that means any compromising situations or anything that someone says that feels sort of threatening to our well-being or our survival is going to be a huge trigger. It's just going to set you off in a big way, right? And a lot of times we don't realize that the trigger itself is actually setting us off because there's just this really deep unhealed part of us that is perhaps terrified of death or terrified of rejection or terrified of not being accepted. And, you know, that's what's really underneath all of it. But how we respond or how we react to that trigger can really show up in a lot of different ways, right? So it just depends on your personal experiences that you've had in the past that will determine how you're going to react to it in that moment. Does it also create a feeling of like contraction or worry or stress? Like what comes to the surface when you are triggered emotionally by something that somebody says or does? Really observe that. So it's like examining and observing ourselves when we're interacting with other people, when we're communicating with other people. I find to be a very helpful tool. It really helps me to see where I'm at in that moment. Because really ultimately at the end of the day, you can't control other people. You can't control how they're going to show up, what they're going to do, how they're going to act. All you can really ever control is yourself and how you respond to things and how you show up to things and to situations and how you manage, you know, your emotional state, your mental state, your physical and your spiritual state. That's really up to you. That's under your control. Nobody else can control that, and you certainly cannot control somebody else's mental state, spiritual state, emotional or physical state, right? So if you can just stay focused upon yourself and about why you're getting triggered and how you're getting triggered, you're really going to start to recognize that these triggers are actually helping to peel back layers of you. It's helping you to see. It reveals parts of yourself that are unhealed. It reveals parts of yourself that are out of balance, that still need work, you know. And divine masculine and divine feminine are definitely something I was discussing with a client yesterday. It's one of those things that when divine masculine and feminine is not balanced within ourselves, then we often get actually quite triggered, and we can get triggered in both kind of ways, you know, both in feminine and in masculine ways. And what I mean by that is like a certain part of you is going to react a certain way to something, and it's going to be either a very masculine response or it's going to be a very feminine response. So that just depends on what part of you is stronger or more dominant within you. But I don't want to get into like the divine masculine and feminine within us. That's going to be a completely different video actually, because it's a pretty big topic, and how to balance that within us is something that I've also recently had awareness of and why that's necessary. So I will definitely talk about that in another video. But just to keep focusing on triggers for this one and how to overcome your triggers is really going to depend on first how much you're able to understand your triggers, what sets you off, what doesn't set you off. Why something sets you off is going to be key to understanding those triggers and to healing them as well. Like I couldn't heal certain triggers within myself until I really understood what was pissing me off and what was setting me off. And I know now, and I can really see and recognize clearly how, for me, some of my biggest triggers are crossing my boundaries. And that was huge. And that was so huge and so prominent in my life because it was something I really needed to heal. It was something I really needed to work on establishing better boundaries. And so I had this repeating cycle, or there's this perpetuating problem of people constantly overstepping my boundaries and trampling all over them. But the reason why that kept happening was because I didn't know how to set those boundaries and assert them. And then every single time somebody would, you know, cross those boundaries, I would get so triggered, like emotionally, mentally, physically. It literally triggered all of me, like all of my being. And it triggered all of my being so that I could really become aware of what needed healing within me. And once I really started to look at the underlying issue of why I was allowing people to cross my boundaries in the first place. Once I understood that and I started to really heal that and work on that, and even establishing those boundaries, because I didn't actually have like a good defined list of boundaries within myself. I didn't fully understand what my own boundaries were because they were so repeatedly crossed and disrespected from when I was a child all the way into the time that I continued allowing that to happen. So once I understood why that was happening and why I needed to heal my boundaries, it was so much easier to work on. It was so much easier to like bring that back into harmony within myself. And it was like life-changing, because the boundaries that I am aware of now and that I have established now within myself are so incredibly firm and so incredibly in place, and I have such a deep knowingness within myself that is correct for me and that it needs to be there for me, that there's just no way that I'm going to allow anyone in this world to cross those boundaries. And that's when you know that you've healed it, because now it's like the trigger doesn't even happen for me. It doesn't even come up for me because the boundaries are just in place. And with boundaries, I also needed to learn assertiveness. So like the two actually completely go hand in hand. Like you can't have firm boundaries if you're not going to be assertive. And there's something that I really learned in the process, and I think I may have mentioned this in previous videos, but there's something I really learned about my boundaries and about my assertiveness, and that was that nice guys really truly finish last. And it was something that I heard in my 20s a lot. It was something that I heard in my 30s even a lot. I never really understood that statement though. I really kind of didn't get it. It didn't sink in. And now I understand that nice guys finish last because nice guys don't have boundaries. So that's huge. And when you understand that it's not nice that you should be, it's actually kind. Like if we can show up with kindness instead of niceness, because nice people really don't have boundaries a lot of times. They are not going to be assertive, and they're not going to be able to firmly but yet lovingly and confidently be able to assert their boundaries. They're just not going to be able to do that. So recognizing my own personal triggers and really working on them has made an absolute difference in my life. There's just certain things that I could never allow to happen now that I would totally let slide before. And then it was so crazy because after I would get super triggered, right, when somebody would cross a boundary, I wouldn't say anything in the moment. And then I would sit there and just dwell on it and like overthink it and overanalyze it. And I would be so hard on myself, and I would be so pissed at the other person. Like I would just carry this resentment within myself because I didn't know how to process the feeling and the emotion, and I felt disrespected. I felt like the behavior was unjustified. So it was such a difficulty for me in the past, and this is why I'm sharing this, because now that I've overcome it, I really want you to help you understand how you also can overcome everything that triggers you. Once you understand the foundation of that trigger, of what is underneath of that trigger, and what really needs to be healed. So there's also, like I said, there's mental, spiritual, and physical triggers as well. For emotional triggers, the other thing to pay attention to is your responses, and like in the sense of, did I react or respond immediately? Like, was it an instant trigger, which means that it's a pretty deep one? Or was my reaction or my response delayed? And if it was delayed, then that actually gives you a pretty clear indication that, okay, this is something that's actually beginning to heal within me. I didn't knee-jerk reaction to it the way that I have in the past. So that's a pretty good indication that you're on the right path in like overcoming that trigger. But that means that if there's still a response, like a negatively charged response within you, then you still need to examine what is still underneath of that trigger, what is still buried within me that I need to just unearth and dig out and reveal to myself and be truthful about and really work on. So, because again, we can't control other people. You will never be able to control other people and what they say and how they respond and how they show up and how they treat you, right? But what you can do is you can show others, how you want to be treated by having those firm boundaries, by knowing what your triggers are, knowing how to respond when you get triggered. Because even still, now that I've overcome so many of my triggers, there sometimes still are things that'll just get me, like almost instantly. I'll just have this like sort of visceral reaction to things. But now I don't respond to it the same way. So when I notice a reaction like that come up within me, then the instant next step for me is to examine it. Like I just pause and I just examine it, like, oh, that kind of set me off. Okay, what's that all about? And I'll start to really look at it, in a deeper way. Also, to keep in mind is like, how long were you upset for? Keep that in mind when you're observing your triggers. How long was I upset for? Was it like for a few minutes? Was it for a couple of hours? Was it for like a day? Like, did it ruin my whole day? Or was it for several days? Was it for weeks, months, years? Like, really pay attention to that, like how long the intensity lasts for, or the energetic charge of that trigger. How long does that last for within you? Pay attention to that. Now moving on to mental triggers. Mental triggers are definitely things that have to do with the thought, with the mind, right? So they usually come from how you were taught to think and whether your thoughts and ideas were validated or not as a child. So a lot of our mental triggers will come from that. I know for me, for example, like when I was a kid and I'd come home with like a B or a C, then, or even like just an A, my father's reaction often would be like, well, if it was an A, then he would say, okay, well, but why isn't it an A plus? Like he wouldn't say, well, good job, honey, for getting the A. It would be, well, how come it's not an A plus? Or if it was a B, then, why isn't it an A? Right? So those are the types of seeds that were planted within me that slowly but surely kind of took away my confidence in terms of my mental capabilities, in terms of how I thought and how I problem solved and how I did different things like that in school. So it started to like degrade that and break it down, right? And every time you hear those things, and every time that you heard those things, perhaps as a child growing up, or even from teachers, right? Sometimes we had some teachers that were not very good at being supportive and didn't really understand psychology, and would say really, really inappropriate things to children that would really break their self-confidence and to make that child feel dumb or stupid or not enough, right? Because they weren't perhaps performing to the level that was expected of them, right? So in terms of the mental triggers, so how long did I replay the scenario in my mind? That would be something to ask yourself. Like when something happens or you're kind of like triggered mentally and your brain just like implodes and goes into like overdrive in terms of overthinking and overprocessing things, ask yourself or kind of try to pay attention in that moment. And I know it can be hard sometimes when we get triggered, but if you can just bring a little awareness and a little consciousness to your daily existence and to yourself on a much deeper level, instead of focusing so much on the outside, on other people's actions, behaviors, things that they say, then you can really start to understand and observe yourself in a much higher perspective, and you're going to really see yourself in a different light. This is called self-awareness. This is how you really learn and understand who you are on a significantly deeper level. And you start to establish a connection with yourself that you perhaps have never had before. It's just this level of awareness I find that I have within myself that I really didn't have before. And I'm so grateful for it, because I really notice how much this awareness is actually helping me to literally like mature into a whole different person and to grow into a whole different person. I mean, that's what spiritual development is. It's a mental, emotional, spiritual maturing that takes place within us, right? And so the more aware we can become of who we are fundamentally right now in this moment, as you are, the more aware you become of that, the more control you actually start to have over yourself and your life and your life trajectory. Because now you're going to have this awareness of, you know, your shortcomings and those things, those shadows and those different parts of yourself that you really still need to work on to continue elevating yourself. We only elevate when we work on ourselves. We only elevate when we're willing to be super real and honest and raw about, you know, what still needs healing within us, because each and every single one of us has experienced trauma, or if not trauma necessarily, but then difficulty and different challenges in life, right? And those different challenges have all, if you were quite unconscious during those periods, then they're going to leave, you know, sort of like trauma wounds. They're going to leave different kind of damage, different levels of damage within your psyche, within your emotions, within your spiritual body, and even your physicality, right? So awareness, I truly find, is like key. It is everything to really be able to master oneself. So think about, like, you know, do I overthink situations? I'm going to put my hand up right here. I'm super guilty of that. I know I definitely sometimes will overthink things. It's actually getting a lot better. And now I notice when the overthinking really starts to kick in, I just have this level of awareness where I'm like, oh, I'm doing it again. Okay. Like pause. I try to, like, you know, back up a minute and really, I just remind myself that, you know what, like, I don't need to overthink this. Everything is okay. And, you know, just like let it go, move on, next thing. So I'm getting definitely a lot better at it. Oh, I just needed to stretch my leg. Yeah. So did I dwell on it for some time? And if you did, how long were you dwelling on that something? What else? Do I overanalyze situations? Or like what was said and done? Do I overthink or overanalyze my own responses? That's a really big one that I will often think about, because I definitely had the tendency to overanalyze my own responses, what I said or what I did or how I showed up, and then, you know, think about it for days and usually judge the shit out of it, right? And, like, you know, analyze it from like 20 different angles. And I realize now that that was actually so unhealthy. And now that I understand why I was doing that, which actually I wrote down here, that it stems from not feeling good enough. The overthinking, overanalyzing always comes from not feeling good enough. So again, that's like a worthiness issue that you're going to need to work on foundationally. And then in terms of spiritual triggers, spiritual triggers are based on your value system. So what you innately find just or unjust is really your value system when it comes to yourself or when it comes to other people. So like seeing other people suffering, that is actually going to trigger you spiritually, because there's just this innate knowing, there's this innate feeling within you that that's wrong. And that's spiritual wisdom. That is like a core value that I feel like as humans we're programmed with by spirit before we even come here. That's why we have, you know, issue with that. That's why we struggle with seeing other people suffering, and it really bothers us. Not everyone, some people are psychopaths, but the general public is definitely going to be negatively impacted or affected when they see others suffering. Just think about how you respond to when you watch the news, or when you see, you know, like a bunch of people died in Ukraine or wherever, like all over the world, you know, people are constantly dying from different tragedies and different things. And like how you feel about that, how you respond to that, how you're triggered by that is actually a spiritual trigger. Having your basic survival needs met, like shelter, food, water, clothing, those are also things that are going to trigger us. So when we feel like we don't have enough of something, where like if someone doesn't have a home, a homeless individual, can you imagine the the level of spiritual suffering that individual goes through. This isn't just oh my gosh, something's in my eye. This isn't just like a mental or a, oh sorry guys, there we go. It wouldn't be just a mental or emotional or physical trigger for that person. It would be all of the above, but it would be most essentially, it would be like that person, a homeless person, becomes spiritually broken. And they become spiritually broken because we are, again, encoded with this deep knowing and understanding that basic survival is our human right. You know, having food, having shelter, having clean water to drink, having clothing to keep our bodies warm. These are all absolutely basic human rights. And when an individual doesn't have that in this world, can you imagine how abandoned they feel? Can you imagine how incredibly lonely and isolated they feel from the rest of society? It's like they're among a whole bunch of people, and people could be passing by, you know, every single day. They're around people, yet they're completely alone, and they're completely broken down spiritually. It's like they get this sense of ostracization, like they've been absolutely shoved and pushed out of society. And then when you think about how, you know, we respond to homeless people, it can be really terrible. So many of us will judge, right? And won't give them money because, well, they're just going to spend it on drugs and alcohol. Well, dude, if you were sleeping on the street, man, you'd be wanting to be high or drunk every fucking day too, because it really is soul breaking and soul crushing for an individual to experience that. Lack of established connection with a higher power, that also actually will trigger people spiritually quite intensely. And this this lack of established connection, so not necessarily believing in God, or not necessarily believing in a higher power, and not believing that a higher power, you know, has your back and wants you to be safe and to be provided for, is a massive triggering of actually fear of death. Because the underlying the underlying energy of fear is actually death. So what we innately all fear is death, is the ending of ourselves in this physical human form. So when your value system is ignored or trampled on by others, that actually will also trigger you spiritually. Personal boundaries, when they're not established within the self, will also, or when they're crossed by other people, those are also going to be actually more spiritual triggers as well. Because again, there's this, we all have an innate knowing of what we deserve and what we don't deserve. And even if your self-confidence has completely been trampled in your lifetime, you're still going to have this experience of just subconsciously knowing, you know, that that's not okay. And so there will be huge triggers around that as well. Physical triggers. Now, physical triggers can be a triggering of some or all 5 of your senses. So like you could get like a whiff of something, just a smell of something, and it could really take you back to a certain place, to a certain situation, to a certain person, remembering something that really had a deep impact on you. This could be both positive or negative. I know I listed kind of mostly negative examples here, but there are a lot of positive triggers as well that we can have. And physically, like for example, when my grandma passed many, many years ago, oh wow, huge ringing in my ear. When my grandma passed many, many years ago, she always used to wear lavender, and that just kind of was her scent. And when she passed, I remember, and we lived in her house initially, I remember smelling lavender on occasion, and it would just be like, oh my God, grandma. It was like an instant knowing that it was like my grandma's energy, or that she was around me, because I would just smell lavender. So that would be like a positive example of a trigger, but there obviously would be negative examples too of those same kind of triggers. Like for example, smelling a certain scent that could take you back to some kind of traumatic situation, or a scent of a person that you had a bad memory with, or something traumatic with, that definitely could set you off. Or I don't know if you ever remember going somewhere or being somewhere, and all of a sudden you'll smell like a certain sweet smell of like candy or a certain food or something, and it'll trigger like a childhood memory, right? So there's so many different types of triggers that we can have, both positive and negative. And paying attention to them, like I said, is really going to be key, and so really start looking at these triggers as something that is constantly helping you. It is giving you evidence of where you are at and giving you evidence of what still needs healing within you if those triggers happen to be negative triggers. Seeing something specific, you know, could trigger you as well, or something that you touch or someone that touches you can trigger a certain feeling, a certain memory that it can take you back to. Fear of a certain animal, because in the physical here I listed that. So fear of a certain animal, this can be trauma-based, it could be symbolic, or it could be past life. So even paying attention to that. It's like I know lots of people who are afraid of spiders, or I know a certain family member and she's like terrified of snakes, like really terrified of snakes. And that too is very well could be a past life issue for her, a past life trauma. Perhaps she was bitten by a snake and died from a snake bite in a previous lifetime. Or it could just very well be what the snake symbolizes and her having a deep fear of what that snake is actually representing symbolically. So I would actually really encourage you to look up the animal or the insect that you're afraid of and check the spiritual meaning, like directly put in like spiritual meaning of snake or spiritual meaning of spider or whatever, and put that in to the search bar and look that up and see what that animal actually represents to you. And as you're reading through, really listen to your intuition and just trust that intuition in terms of what rings true to you as you're reading it. Because I'll read, for example, I had the stink bug showing up for me a whole bunch last summer. So I kept looking up the stink bug meaning, and I would find different websites and I would look it up in many different ways. And I would always find exactly the thing that I would resonate with when I read the meaning or the symbolic meaning of that insect. So it was really, really cool. And I still do that. I constantly look up all kinds of animals and bugs that show up for me. So it's a guidance. It provides guidance for me. So yeah, so that's basically it. Yeah, so look up what that animal and insect represents spiritually and find out what is aligned or not aligned within you, because that's really what it will show. So that's kind of just sort of some of the basics I wanted to put together about triggers and how we get triggered. And I hope that this was helpful for you. My main message here with this video is really to pay attention to what you are truly set off by, how it's setting you off in a positive or in a negative direction. If it's negative, then really dig deeper within yourself. Look at what that is symbolically representing, or what within you it's connecting to. You know, if it's fear that arises and that's what you're being triggered of, what is the fear connected to? Is it fear of not being loved, fear of rejection, fear of not being accepted? Is it a fear of being hurt or harmed, right? Like really look at that. And once you start to analyze yourself a little bit deeper, you're going to really inch yourself closer and closer to self-mastery. The number one thing that I am finding within myself is that the more I understand myself on a deeper level, everything from my good side to my bad, to my shadow, to my light, the more I understand it, the more I am connected to myself, and the more that I can really navigate my life with certainty, with clarity, and just with a deeper understanding. So yeah, I hope this was helpful for you. Yeah, and I really appreciate you being here. Thank you for liking and subscribing to the channel if you like this type of content, if you find it helpful. And drop a comment, comment and let me know in the comment section what you guys are triggered by, what kind of things are setting you off, and let's kind of chat about it together and see what that could mean for you. I definitely always get back to people in the comment section, so feel free to reach out. I do not bite, and I'm more than happy to guide you on your spiritual journey and evolution. Thanks for watching. Until next time.